A few months ago, I gave a presentation at the European Communications, ISKCON Europe Communications Conference, which was in Nuvrajanmandala in Spain. And my subject was keeping cows in the center, which you may notice is a bit of a play on another expression that we've often used. Keeping cows in the center, cow care in present and future ISKCON. So that's kind of the broader theme, which I want to say a little bit about. But I think that's, in a way, the theme that we have for very much of our conference, in a sense. So I thought what may be more useful, interesting as a focus is that I say a little bit about the book that I've been working on, and which is coming out. According to the publisher, it'll be available November, we just lost it. It'll be available November 25th. How do we keep it alive?
Just plug in his. It's the laptop that's going on.
Can we plug in your laptop so that it won't do that?
Power adapter for the laptop.
Yeah, it's according to the publisher, it's going to be available November 25th. And when it's available, I'm happy to report it will be available in digital form through a system called Open Access. You can see, this is a picture of the front cover of the book, and on the top right, oops, it's on the top right, it says Open Access. And what that means is that if you go to the publisher's website and you go to the book page of the publisher, there will be a button you can click and you can legally download a digital copy of the book. You can also buy a hard copy of the book, but I get no profit from that. But the hard copy is also going to be available. I want to say a bit about ISKCON, cow protection, starting with statistics. And I'm getting these statistics from Kalakantavru. Just first of all, the numbers of centers in ISKCON worldwide that we have at the present time. This may not be completely exact, but the numbers we have as of a few weeks ago, there are some 84 projects that have cows around the world, 47 of which are in India, 9 in North America, 14 in Europe, 3 in Latin America, 3 in Southeast Asia, 2, maybe 3 in Russia, 2 in Africa, and 4 in Australia. Most of the projects have small number of cows, 5 to 10 perhaps. Of course, Gita Nagari has something less than 100, 80 cows. The largest, to our knowledge, well, maybe Siberia or Ukraine is different, but in Tirupati there are some 500 cows. Altogether, this comes to some 5,000 cows being protected in ISKCON. Now, to put this in a certain perspective, we might want to be aware that worldwide, an estimated 34,000 cows per hour are being slaughtered. And this, of course, could be a very discouraging fact, but what I want to suggest is not that we need to increase and increase and increase the number of cows in our projects. It seems rather to me that what is needed is more projects in which we have 1, 2, 5, 10 cows, to the point where people will more associate our movement with cows. Oh, those are the Hare Krishnas, they keep cows. In Berkeley, California, back in the late 60s, when the students would riot, we used to do that as a regular annual activity, protesting the war in Vietnam and so on. And then it would come in the newspapers on account, and they would describe the scene with the police and the National Guard and the students and the tear gas. And they would say, and of course, the Hare Krishnas were there chanting. So what if it would be that, and of course, the Hare Krishnas have their cows? This would, this could be significant, I think. We have some successes in our society to certain degrees and in certain respects, and we've just heard about here, New Vrindavan. We've just seen at Gitanagari. We've heard of problems at Mayapur, and one of the projects that I write about in the book is Mayapur. We have successes, and we want to build on those successes, and we want to learn from the failures. We have had sometimes a problem of attitude, that we think that we know everything because we are Christian devotees. But what we don't realize is that there are people who know things that we can learn from and benefit from in practical ways. And I think now we're all becoming more mature in understanding this. So part of the focus of the ministry is indeed to say, okay, who is there out there that we can learn from? So one of the subjects we'll be discussing is the Amish. We have been meeting with the Amish near Gitanagari. So I think I'll just talk about what is in this book, but before I do that, something about how it came about that I'm writing this book. It was mentioned that I'm a research fellow of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, which is a recognized independent center of Oxford University since several years. And this is an institution that's been started by devotees and is continued, is running by devotees. It's Hindu studies, but within Hindu studies, we do Vaishnava studies. We ended up with Hindu studies because everyone said, what is that? Vaishnava became too complicated to explain. Also in Oxford, there is a small institute called the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. And one day they invited me to give a talk on Hinduism and animal ethics. This led to further interaction with their center. And one day the director of their center invited me to write a book on Hinduism and animal ethics for the book series of which he is the editor in this particular, for this publisher, on animal ethics. Initially I wasn't greatly enthusiastic, but over at least 2-year period, he asked me 3 times would I write such a book. And the last time he asked me, he said, I want you to write the book because you're a practitioner. And something went ding, it sounds like Krishna wants me to do something. And then I thought, well, what would be interesting for me to write about, because it is of great concern to our tradition, is cows. And knowing that the issue of cow protection is highly political in India, I knew that to write such a book is going to be a great challenge, but that it ought to be done. So the director of the center, when I said, what if I focus on cows? He said, great, go for it. So that's what I've done. The publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, is an academic publisher, which means most of their works, most of their titles are rather inaccessible to sort of us ordinary mortals. But this is one reason that I've arranged to make the book available to anyone through open access. Palgrave Macmillan, at one time, there were two separate companies, and one of them was Macmillan, which you may know published Sheila Prabhupada's Bhagavad-Gita. And Palgrave Macmillan is now a subsidiary of Springer Nature, which is a company which earns more than $1 billion per year. They're a massive company. And they have a huge network which makes it possible for any book produced to become available at any university in the world through their digital network. So it's, I think, a good platform on which to present these ideas.
Sorry, you did play first.
Yes, okay. So I thought I'll just say something about the contents. And what time should I stop? 12. Oh, we have lots of time. Okay, and we can maybe have some discussion. The book has 7 chapters. I'm actually always confused about the chapter numbers because the publisher insisted that introduction is chapter 1. For me, introduction is introduction, and then comes chapter 1, but okay, whatever. What I do in the first, they call it chapter 2, is a kind of literary overview. I call it the release of cosmic cows because in the Rig Veda there are accounts, especially related to Indra's exploits, especially his killing of Vritra, which refers to cows being released. And the association of cows and water is very significant in the Rig Veda. Cows, water, and also these rays of the sun in the morning. The Rig Veda is extremely poetic text. And the reference to cows in the Rig Veda comes to some 700 times that cows are referred to, mainly with the word go, but also other words. So I give an overview, basically, that runs through Rig Veda, Upanishads, Mahabharata, and then the center, you can say, is the Bhagavatam, in which the focus is Krishna in Vrindavan, the fact that Krishna takes care of cows, which I then return to later in the book. I also refer a bit to some later poetry of the Vaishnava tradition, Brajvasa poetry, and I quote something. This was actually quite frustrating. The publisher, my editor with the publisher, I wanted to quote one complete poem from Surdas, and a beautiful poem about Krishna as Damodar stealing the milk. But my editor said, "I'm sorry, but you cannot do this." Why not? Well, there are very strict copyright rules, even more strict with poetry than anything else. I said, but this is a translation. Yes, it includes translation. So I had to sort of summarize the poem, which, loses the sweetness, and then just give 3 or 4 or 5 lines of it. With the next chapter, the plot thickens, so to say, because I jump to modern history, beginning with the late 19th century, and what comes to be called the cow protection movement. In the 1880s, one personality, Dayanand Saraswati, wrote a pamphlet called I'm forgetting the Sanskrit and Hindi name at the moment, but he wrote a pamphlet, about a 20-page pamphlet in Hindi, Gujarati, and this pamphlet had huge impact, and it became sort of a marking point that was the beginning of what became more and more of a political movement, which fed into the nationalist movement, the independence movement of India. And so the identification of cow protection with Hinduism, with national independence, they all kind of coalesced in complicated ways. This involved also Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, better known as Mahatma Gandhi. So I introduce Gandhi, who wrote considerably and also was very concerned about cow protection. And then a lesser-known figure for most of present-day devotees was B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar was one of the major drafters of the Indian Constitution, and he became also president of India. And he came from what is called an untouchable or outcast or Dalit background. And he used to argue with Gandhi about Varna and ashram and Hinduism. And basically he was rejecting the idea that the caste system could be reformed. Toward the end of his life, he officially became a Buddhist, along with about 50,000 of his followers. And he wrote a book in which he analyzes how untouchability developed in India and ties it into meat eating as the emblem, the sign of one who is outcast, especially beef eating. So I talk about him, but then I conclude that section with an introduction to Sheila Prabhupada. And with Sheila Prabhupada, what I emphasize is that whereas the first 3 are very much concerned about Hinduism, Sheila Prabhupada, to put it in a sort of vernacular way, couldn't care less about Hinduism. Not only that, but he was concerned that cow protection is not about India, it's something for the world. And so Prabhupada indeed introduced, and he's recognized for this. At least one scholar I know has pointed this out, that it was Srila Prabhupada who introduced cow protection to the West. Well, things also become complicated on an intellectual level, and that is the issue of sacrifice, animal sacrifice, and the historical development of the idea of ahimsa. And so I go into some of the nitty-gritty of this, what became controversial, and you can say is still controversial for some. Books have been written, articles have been written. Some who identify themselves as champions of cow protection insist that there never was in ancient time the sacrifice of animals in ritual sacrifice. And they will argue extensively on this point. Again, Srila Prabhupada never said that. We find it extensively in Vedic literature, very detailed description of animal sacrifice. And so I bring this whole discussion together essentially to say what Srila Prabhupada said, which was, in this age, animals are not to be sacrificed. Why is that? Because there is no qualification to do it. Animal sacrifice as such is not a bad thing. Why is it not a bad thing? Because it's understood that the animal is elevated by the process, and that's a big if. And so we find it's not done. I talk about violence, non-violence, and cows in Bhagavad-Gita and Bhagavatam in one section, in which I kind of juxtapose Srila Prabhupada and Gandhi, because as we know, Gandhi had a particular take on the Bhagavad-Gita, which Srila Prabhupada vociferously argued against, which was that the Bhagavad-Gita is essentially about ahimsa. Srila Prabhupada said, how can you say that when Krishna is telling Arjuna, stand up and fight? Gandhi had an interesting argument for that. And then the Bhagavatam, how the Bhagavatam recognizes animal sacrifice and quite clearly condemns it. Condemns it because it's leading to a mentality, to an attitude which is completely against that of devotion to the Lord. Well, then I became a sort of, I would say, an amateur ethnographer. I went to India, I visited goshalas, our ISKCON goshalas and others, small goshalas as small as 10 cows to large goshalas up to 45,000 cows. And I talked with the people and recorded my discussions with them. I learned a lot, and I simultaneously realized how I became more and more frustrated as I was doing this research at how little I know and how much more there is to know. But because the publisher gave me a contract with a 2-year time deadline, I simply had to be satisfied with what knowledge I could gather. As you can see here, I focus on this issue of what I call added value. The idea, if we have cows that are protected, then the products of the cows have a certain added value for those who understand why there is added value, the fact that they are protected. And I also talk about the issue of violence with respect to male bovines with bulls. Because I met in the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics, I met people who I think would identify themselves as abolitionist vegans. There's a whole spectrum of vegans, and one category is called abolitionist vegan. Abolitionist is one who wants to abolish that humans have any interaction at all with animals. Why? Because their reasoning is that any interaction with animals will invariably be exploitative of the animals. To which we might say, you know what, you're right, up to a point. You're right as long as one is not Krishna conscious. There will be exploitation of animals in a human-animal, human, non-human, they will say, and human, non-human animal relationship is bound to be exploitative. So I discuss in the book the ideas of the vegans, and I say actually they have very good points. And Vaishnavas or Hindu, I use the term Vaishnava Hindu a few times, can actually learn something from them. However, we don't accept that there should be no relation with animals. Quite the opposite. If we can understand what our relationship should be based on what is our relationship to the Supreme Person, to God, then we can relate to animals as is appropriate. And thus we can use their products. I speak about what I call intangible benefits of bovines, both their care and also their proximity. Simply having cows in proximity, of course, we understand, is very good. One lady, devotee, who lives just next to the Mayapur project, my godsister, Srimati Devi, from Germany, keeps about 10 cows. I interviewed her, and in the course of the interview, at one point, she said, keeping cows, you keep your sanity. And I thought that's so brilliant. So that became one of the subtitles, and I just described her situation. So this chapter was on present-day practices in India. From here, I kind of stepped back from specifically cow care to the subject of animal ethics. Since the book is going in a book series on animal ethics, I felt I need to say something more general. And so I talk about Dharma in 3 different aspects, and then I suggest there's one way of understanding animal ethics from a Hindu perspective is with a polarity. There's Dharma on one side and there's Bhakti on the other, and the link between the two is yoga. So I move from Dharma, which is of course focused on notions of rules, of order, of boundaries. And I moved from there into a discussion of yoga, and from yoga into bhakti. And here I capitalized, so to say, on the story of Jadabharata. Jadabharata is, of course, we know the story, but there's a lot in this story which I found very useful for talking about animal ethics. And what I felt I need to do is to connect our Vaishnava tradition to modern Western discourse on animal ethics. Confirmed. So since the last perhaps 40 years, perhaps more, there's been an acceleration of discussion of what is now called animal ethics in the West. And this tends to take two directions. One is animal welfare, and the other is animal rights. Confirmed again. She said, yes, yes. So I wanted to see how can we relate Dharma and yoga and bhakti to animal welfare and animal rights. Well, it turns out there's a third direction that's developed just since the early 1980s, and that's called the ethics of care. And interestingly enough, the ethics of care comes out of the feminist movement, the intellectual feminist movement, but from a branch of feminism which we may say is nice, and that is the idea that women are mothers, and mothers know how to take care of their children. They don't need so much rules, they don't need rights, they just need their natural feelings for their child, and they know what to do. So that idea then is being extended out, so to say, to consider how can we relate this principle in wider society. Well, that's all very well and good, but there's no metaphysical basis. So that's where that's where the Hare Krishnas come in and say we've got a metaphysical basis for the ethics of care, and that is bhakti. Yeah. Oh, I see. They're talking to each other. Yeah.
A truck is what said.
So, okay, animal citizenship, community, and bhakti. The idea of cows as citizens. Interesting idea. A couple of scholars have written a book called Zoopolis, in which they argue that the animal rights movement has come to basically a dead end because there's no understanding of what's needed, the next step, which is to understand animals as citizens. And they go into great detail about what they mean by that. It's quite comprehensive. So I draw from their ideas and suggest in what ways we might similarly understand. Again, Sheila Prabhupada said, the king is caring for all of the citizens of the kingdom. Praja is the Sanskrit word. And Prabhupada always emphasized this includes the animals. So again, I'm just bringing in this. From here I move into futures for cows, and this is another quote from the Rig Veda. These cows will not be lost. So the chapter is called These Cows Will Not Be Lost, envisioning a careful future for cows. I kind of play on the word careful to make it careful, full of care. And I use this expression, cow care, more than cow protection because I feel that it is in some sense more inclusive. it's including cow protection. If you're caring for cows, you're also protecting them. But you're doing so many things. You're doing all that needs, all activities for the cows. And here I borrow a term from one Christian theologian who has written in relation to ecology, environmentalism, and development of communities. He has the idea of anticipatory communities. So I give a sketch of two of our anticipatory communities, Mayapur and New Vrajadam in Hungary. I chose New Vrajadam for a few reasons. One, practical, because I'm in Europe, so it was easy to visit there. I wanted to also include Gita Nagari. However, there's with so many restrictions from the publisher, one of them was word count. They said you can write maximum 100,000 words, including your notes, including your bibliography, not one word more. So I had to keep it limited in that way. With each of these, I'm not trying to say, look at this wonderful project, here we have the solution. What I'm saying is these are anticipatory. They're works in progress. They have shortcomings. However, they are doing something significant, which can be, in some degrees, they can be perhaps leading toward better models. I talk about departing bovine souls because this becomes a big question. What about taking care of aged cows? And I refer to two cases, one at Bhaktivedanta Manor and one ashram, which is not an ISKCON center in Wales, where the government interfered and said this cow has to be, as they say, put down. Those are longer stories. I won't go into them. It's in the book. But I tell a happy story, which is described in one of the issues of the newsletter of the Care for Cows project of Kurmarupa Prabhu in Vrindavan, where Krishna, the bull, who was one of two bulls pulling the Padayatra cart for several years in India, gave up his body in Vrindavan. And it's a wonderful description of how the devotees respected this beautiful Kangraj bull. And then I come to when cow protection activism becomes counterproductive, and within that, I say that cow protection can be considered in three qualities, three gunas. So it comes back to the politics in India. There's the vigilantism that's going on in India. And I suggest that this is cow protection in tamaguna. In other words, it's not bringing the actual benefit, the actual result that's wanted. It involves violence, sometimes killing innocent people, and of course rejecting the idea of the rule of law. Political activism in India, I suggest, to a large extent, can be seen as Rajaguna, cow protection. A lot of promises are made by politicians, not much action that's actually beneficial for real cows. Cows become a symbol more than consideration of cows as living beings. And this can be a problem. But then in Sattva-guna, and then at the end of my book, I have an upbeat message. And the upbeat message is that if you consider what I call affirmations, how care could be done, I word them in the form of what are called affirmations in modern day positive psychology, where you make a statement, a positive statement, in the present tense, even it may not be the reality yet. And so I have a list of positive statements describing, with 2 or 3 paragraphs to each one, elaborating how cow protection could be practiced. Again, not just in India, but all over the world. So that's a bit of an overview of the book that's just now coming. You're welcome to download the book when it's available. You search Palgrave Macmillan, Animal Ethics. That'll bring you to the page of the book series, and there you'll see the title, Cow Care in Hindu Animal Ethics. Hare Krishna.